Hello there. Last night, Dominic Raab said that after this crisis is over, it cannot be business as usual with China. But what does that mean? Firstly, as ever, please kick that YouTube algorithm up the jacksie by giving this video a big fat like. And I'm always uploading new content, so please do check my YouTube channel daily. With so many indications that the Communist Party in Beijing is responsible for this worldwide health crisis, how could the rest of the world ever hold them to account? Despite the best efforts of the Beijing PR machine, the fingers of accusation are pointing firmly at the Chinese Communist Party as the culpable party for this global healthcare crisis and the resultant economic havoc. The human tragedy, both national and individual, is unfolding before our eyes, and if a group of people are responsible for this, the questions are, should they be held to account and made to pay? How do we hold them to account? What do they owe and to who? And how do we make them pay? And most importantly, where do we start? Now, in last night's daily crisis press conference, the UK temporary PM Dominic Raab said that the UK will not be able to go back to business as usual with China once this is all over. And he also said that the UK will want there to be a deep dive international investigation into the causes of this criminal tragedy. We ought to look at all sides of this and do it in a balanced way, but there is no doubt we can't have business as usual after this crisis, he said. We will have to ask the hard questions about how it came about and why it couldn't have been stopped earlier. There are already increasingly strident calls for the UK to now disentangle itself from the Beijing web, as doubt grows over the true origin of the crisis and the lack of transparency by the Chinese government, especially in the light of yesterday's news that the casualty rate at the epicentre in China is now 50% higher than they previously reported. And the rest. But it's not like doubts over Beijing had started just recently. There had, for example, already been calls for the Chinese state-controlled tech giant Huawei to be removed from involvement in the new UK 5G telecommunications infrastructure. And this was due to deep suspicions that China would use it to insert spyware into our comms network, something that worries the Donald Trump administration too. Remember that Huawei had already been designated by the UK as a high-risk vendor before the decision to involve them had been taken in January this year. Then there's the Chinese involvement in the UK nuclear power programme at Hinkley Point C in Somerset to consider, which is destined, it seems, to provide the UK with the most expensive electricity in the world. But the one at the forefront of the news at the moment is Huawei and 5G. As you will know, the government agreed to use Huawei for 35% of the non-sensitive or non-core part of the 5G infrastructure. And any Huawei equipment that is already in our core comms system has to be removed by 2023. Now, as I've already said, there have been calls for Huawei's involvement to either be halted or at least for it to be even more severely time-limited, so we could use them for a couple of years at most while we get someone else in and then sever the Chinese connection. But given recent events, this has now become a political imperative. It can't wait for a couple of years. Many politicians will now want a more immediate reaction, a public show of distrust in the Chinese Communist Party. Because without something public and tangible, and quick, the UK government will look weak and powerless in the face of Chinese might. And once the mayhem is over, there will probably be a mounting public anger with questions asked and answers demanded. The people are rightly focused, right now, on surviving both the health effects and the economic ramifications of the lockdown. But once that's cleared, attention will quickly move on to the causes. Blame will be cast. And our politicians will be acutely aware that if they can't deal with the true culprits, then the voters will deal with the politicians at the next election. So Huawei might look like a piece of low-hanging political fruit here. But the Times reports today that plans put in place by the BT-owned company EE to swap out Huawei equipment already within our core and replace it with kit from the Swedish company Ericsson by this year have been pushed back to 2023. So according to the Times, BT is saying that the UK can't remove Huawei involvement in our core comms network until at least 2023. That'll cause some gnashing of political teeth. So what do we do? How do we hold Beijing to account? And let's rule out military action from the start, shall we? Now, any action would have to be lawful, and for the best effect taken in collaboration with others, such as the US and the EU. I published a video a while ago covering suggestions put forward on this subject in a report by the Henry Jackson Society, where the authors of the report had worked out that this crisis is costing the UK £2.4 billion per day. But that we'd need to pursue China through the courts to get reparations. And one of the authors of the report, Dr. Alan Mendoza, told the Express that were the UK to pursue a claim against China and secure a judgment that mandated compensation, and were China then to ignore it, we would be entitled to pursue any lawful means for collection on that judgment. The possibilities might include seizing Chinese state-owned property or halting repayment on Chinese-owned sovereign debt. And the figures bandied about were that China could hold some 15% of UK sovereign debt, which could be worth as much as £267 billion. And just for background, at the end of 2019, a UK Debt Management Office report said that the total nominal outstanding stock of central government sterling wholesale debt, excluding official holdings by central government, was £1,560.8 billion, or £1.56 trillion if you prefer. So not paying the interest and capital on that Chinese portion of the debt would go a long way to redressing the economic side of any UK damages. But then I got thinking, surely we're not the only ones talking about this. What would happen if the US also went down this path? How much US debt does Beijing hold? US debt stands at $23 trillion, and out of that nearly $7 trillion worth is held by foreign nations. And as you can see from this pie chart of the top 10 US debt holders, in January this year, China owned 15.73% of US debt, equating to $1,079 billion worth, or $1 trillion worth. That's just behind Japan's holdings, and you can see from the chart that the UK holds the third largest chunk of US debt. So if the US were to deem non-repayment of that debt owed to China as reparations, then $1,000 billion or $1 trillion would go a long way to sorting their damages out. But, and there is a big but, any court action and subsequent negotiations that would make this the route to follow would take years, maybe even decades. And by then, China could have shifted those bonds onto the markets and sold them off. It could also have sold off any assets held in countries which would be likely to take Beijing to court, like the US and the UK. And if all this was dumped on the markets in one go, it could depress prices and might cause us a bit of an economic headache. But could China reciprocate? What about Chinese national debt? Who owns that? Could Beijing default on that in retaliation? Well, most of theirs seems to be internal to the country, and ownership of Chinese debt appears to be a very opaque business. I couldn't find much info on it at all, but I expect there's an expert out there who can enlighten us. However, China would also have to be aware that just retaliating with no legal right to do so would not endear themselves to the international community, so probably damage their trading ambitions in the process. So the legal route against China will be a lengthy one. And what if we lose the case in the international courts? That's something to consider. Now there is another route of redress, that of removing China from all our supply chains. That's very legal, as long as it follows the law covering any contracts or treaties already in place. Instead of relying on long supply chains, we could then onshore that previously offshored industry, so removing the need for reliance on China. But that will be exactly what our politicians do not want. Our politicians are driven by the green agenda. Our politicians are committed to UK zero carbon by 2050. And without China continuing to act as our carbon sink, as well as providing extremely cheap labour, then we'd have to ditch that green programme. In short, we can't have both. Unless you want to turn the clock back on the way we live about 100 years. We in the UK buy, use and rely on carbon-heavy items, but most of the carbon emitted while producing them is emitted in China. Then more carbon is emitted from bunker-fueled freighters or airliners bringing the stuff here. So inshoring manufacturing and the like will not, I think, be on the political agenda. But finding another country far away to take the place of China might be. India maybe? Who knows? At the end of the day, from what I can see, holding Beijing to account will be a long drawn-out affair, whichever route we take. But what it should teach us is that at the end of the day, UK self-reliance is probably the most effective way of safeguarding our future security and prosperity. Greater food security, greater energy security, greater health security, shorter supply chains, more control over our own borders, and therefore more control over our own safety and our own destiny. I.e., globalism can take a hike. But in a free market, companies will continue to chase the most cost-effective. They may have been stung by this event and be a bit wary for a while, but they will in the end start actively chasing the cheapest from around the world to increase their profit margins. Be in no doubt about that. So could all this happen again? Well, that's up to us, the consumers. How we spend our money will dictate the direction of the markets. And that may be the quickest way to hold Beijing to account. By buying from UK sources wherever you can. Anyway, if you want to hear more from me, please don't forget to subscribe and also press that little bell, or you won't get any notifications. And if you want to see more of me, buy a mug with my mug on it. So, what do you think about holding Beijing to account? Please share and comment, and thank you for watching.